Kang Joon-seo steps out onto the sidewalk, black suit, open collar, gold chain, the calm of a man nobody touches. Then a small voice catches him. A little girl in a blue shirt stands stiff, tears on her cheeks, holding out a single $1 note with both hands like it's all she owns. Kang's men shift, fast, protective, suspicious. Kang lifts a finger, and the street goes quiet around them. He crouches to her level, eyes sharp but steady. She doesn't ask for food. She doesn't ask for mercy. She says she's hiring him, because the police told her to wait, and waiting is how people disappear. Then she whispers the sentence that makes Kang's face go still, "If I tell anyone, my mom won't come home." Kang notices the details, her trembling hands, dirt on her knees, the way she glances over her shoulder like she's being watched. He takes the $1, not for its value, but because accepting it means accepting responsibility. The narrator pivots. Kang has a rule: never get involved with children. Tonight, a $1 note makes him break it. Sophie smoothed the crumpled bill on the scarred wooden surface of the desk, her fingers trembling just enough to make the paper whisper against the grain. It was a single dollar, crisp but lonely, looking entirely out of place in the dimly lit office. She pushed it toward him, her gaze fixed on his face with a desperate, unwavering intensity. "I'm hiring you," she said. Her voice was thin, brittle as dry glass, but there was an edge of steel beneath it that hadn't been there a moment ago. Kang looked down at the money, then back at her. The neon sign from the noodle shop across the street flickered, casting a rhythmic blue bruise across his sharp features. He didn't reach for the bill immediately. He simply leaned back, the old springs of his chair groaning in protest, and watched her. He had seen fear before, it was the primary currency of his world, but this was different. This was the fear of someone who had already lost everything and was now bartering with the remains. $1, Sophie?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "That's a steep price for what you're asking." "It makes it legal," she countered, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edge of the desk. "It makes it a contract. You're a professional. Take the money, and you're mine until the job is done." A heavy silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of traffic and the steady ticking of a clock that seemed to be counting down to a disaster neither of them could name. Kang reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering over the bill for a heartbeat before his fingers closed around it. He tucked the dollar into his breast pocket with a slow, deliberate motion. "The contract is signed," he murmured, his expression unreadable. He leaned forward, crossing his arms on the desk, bringing himself into the small circle of light shared by them both. The air felt suddenly thicker, charged with the gravity of the commitment. "Now, stop shaking and talk to me. Start from the beginning. What happened tonight that brought you to my door with $1 and a look like you've seen a ghost?" Sophie took a shuddering breath, the professional veneer finally cracking. She looked at the empty space where the money had been, the reality of what she had just initiated settling into her bones. "It wasn't a ghost," she whispered, her eyes dark with a memory she couldn't escape. "It was much worse." Kang didn't just occupy the office, he seemed to haunt it, a shadow given mass and predatory intent. To the outside world, he was a fixer, a man who navigated the gray gutters of the city where the law refused to tread. But to those who whispered his name in the backrooms of high-rise bars and low-end gambling dens, Kang Joon-seo was an inevitability. He was the wall that stood between a debt and a funeral, provided you could pay the toll. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the district he controlled. It wasn't the largest territory in the city, but it was the cleanest. Here, the local syndicates moved with a calculated politeness. They knew that Kang's reach was long and his memory longer. He didn't care about the petty vices or the smuggling of illicit goods, but he enforced a boundary that was written in blood: the innocence of the helpless was not a commodity. In this city, people think power is about how many men you can order to kill, Kang said, his back still turned to Sophie. His silhouette was framed by the jagged skyline, a dark pillar against the neon haze. They're wrong. Power is about knowing where the line is drawn. My line is very simple. He turned back, his eyes narrowing as they caught the light. I don't care who you've offended or whose money you've lost. But if this involves a child, Sophie, if anyone has laid a hand on a kid in my streets, then that dollar you gave me just bought them a ticket to a very shallow grave. It was the iron rule, the singular code that kept his soul from eroding entirely. In a world where everything was for sale, Kang had carved out a space where children were off limits. To break that rule was to invite a ghost into your home. The rumors said Kang had once burned down an entire warehouse with a rival boss locked inside because a shipment of human cargo had included a 10-year-old girl. He hadn't even asked for a fee that time. He watched Sophie closely, looking for the telltale flinch or the shift in her eyes that would signal she was hiding the truth. He needed to know if he was stepping into a war of greed or a rescue mission. Tell me, he pressed, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating low. Is there a child out there waiting for you to come home? Sophie's breath hitched, a jagged sound that tore through the stillness of the room. She didn't flinch at his mention of the iron rule. Instead, she seemed to sag, the weight of her secret finally pulling her down. It's not a child, she whispered, her voice trembling with a different kind of grief. It's my mother. Eunhwa. The name hung in the air, fragile and heavy. Kang knew of Eunhwa, a woman who ran a small laundromat 3 blocks over, a woman whose only sin was working too hard for too little. She was the kind of person who existed on the periphery of the city's violence, never part of it, until suddenly, she was. They took her from the shop, Sophie continued, her words beginning to spill out in a frantic rush. 2 men. No masks. They didn't care who saw them. They just dragged her into a black sedan and drove away like she was nothing. Like she was trash being cleared from the sidewalk. She reached into her bag and pulled out a crumpled police report, tossing it onto the desk. It was barely a page long, filled with cold, bureaucratic apathy. I went to them first, she said, her eyes flashing with a sudden, bitter fire. I waited 6 hours in that station. They told me to go home. They said she's an adult, that she probably just stepped away, that they can't file a missing persons report for 48 hours because there's no evidence of a struggle. But I saw the floor, Kang. I saw the bleach she spilled when they grabbed her. I saw her glasses crushed near the door. She leaned over the desk, her face inches from his. 48 hours is a lifetime. By then, she'll be gone. Truly gone. I'm alone, and the clock is ticking, and I know. I know they aren't coming for her. The police are waiting for a body to make it easy. I need her alive. The desperation in her eyes was a physical force, a silent scream for help in a city that had turned its back. Kang looked at the report, then at the girl who had spent her last dollar to buy a miracle. The police were playing by the book, but the book was written by people who didn't live in the shadows. He felt the familiar coldness settle in his chest, the shift from observer to hunter. If Eunhwa had been taken in broad daylight without fear of the law, it wasn't a random act of violence. It was a message. How much time has passed since the sedan left? Kang asked, reaching for his coat. 5 hours, Sophie replied, her voice small. 5 hours and 12 minutes. Kang checked his watch. The night was half over, and the trail was already cooling. Kang didn't offer a word of comfort, he offered his boots hitting the pavement. He moved through the narrow alleyways with a predator's grace, Sophie trailing in his wake like a ghost. When they reached the laundromat, the scent of spilled bleach still hung sharp and chemical in the damp air, a sterile shroud over the scene of the crime. He ignored the yellow tape the police had lazily strung across the entrance. Kang knelt by the door, his eyes scanning the asphalt with microscopic focus. There, near the curb where the sedan had idled, was a heavy scuff of rubber and a fractured piece of amber plastic, a broken signal light cover. But it wasn't the debris that caught his eye, it was the mark left on the brickwork of the adjacent building. A faint, jagged scrape of black paint sat at shoulder height, left behind when the car had swung wide in a hurried exit. He ran a thumb over the pigment. It wasn't standard automotive paint, it was a high-gloss, reinforced coating used primarily for armored transports. They weren't just thugs, Sophie, Kang muttered, his voice tightening. They were professionals. And they were arrogant. He stood and walked toward a discarded cigarette pack crushed into the gutter a few feet away. He picked it up with a gloved hand. It was an imported brand, Russian, with a distinctive gold foil lining. This wasn't the brand of a street-level dealer. This was the signature of the Koslov network. The Koslovs were more than a gang, they were a corporate entity of the underworld, specializing in high-end human trafficking and debt collection. They moved like a shadow cabinet through the city's infrastructure, buying silence with one hand and breaking bones with the other. They didn't take laundromat owners for pocket change. The black sedan, Kang said, turning to Sophie. Did you see the license plate? Or a logo on the side? No logo, she whispered, her face pale. But the driver, he had a tattoo on his neck. A black bird. A crow with its wings clipped. Kang's jaw set. The clipped crow. That was the mark of the vultures, the Koslov's primary extraction team. They were the ones sent in when a target needed to vanish without a trace. If the vultures had Unhwa, she wasn't being held for ransom. She was being prepared for transit. The weight of the $1 contract in his pocket felt suddenly heavy. He wasn't just looking for a missing woman anymore, he was picking a fight with a mountain. Stay behind me, Kang commanded, his eyes reflecting the cold neon of the streetlights. We're going to a place where crows like to roost. The air in the vulture's gambling den smelled of stale smoke and old iron. Kang moved through the space like a cold front, his presence silencing the low-level chatter of the men guarding the door. He didn't stop until he reached a scarred table at the back where a man with a clipped crow tattoo on his throat sat counting stacks of dirty bills. Unhwa, Kang said, the name a low growl that cut through the clinking of coins. Where is she? The man, a mid-level enforcer named Volkov, didn't look up. He merely smirked, tapping a thick stack of papers on the table. She's in arrears, Kang. $30,000. High-interest gambling debts. We're just collecting what's owed to the Koslov family. Sophie stepped forward, her voice trembling with indignation. That's a lie. My mother doesn't gamble. She doesn't even know how to play cards. She spends every night at that shop. The ledger says otherwise, Volkov replied, finally looking up with eyes as cold as a Siberian winter. He slid a document across the table. It was a forgery, a clumsy, rushed piece of work with a signature that looked nothing like Unhwa's delicate script. The debt is real because we say it is. And if she can't pay in cash, she pays in labor. That's the rule. Kang's hand shot out, pinning Volkov's wrist to the table with a sickening crack of bone. The guards moved, but Kang didn't flinch, his other hand already resting on the hilt of a knife hidden at his belt. Don't lie to me, Kang whispered, leaning in until his breath ghosted over the man's ear. This isn't about a debt. This is leverage. You're holding her to keep someone else quiet, aren't you? A threat to make sure someone doesn't talk to the wrong people. Volkov gritted his teeth, his face turning a mottled purple. She's already been processed for transfer, Kang. The paperwork is gone. She's being moved to the docks tonight. By morning, she won't be a person anymore. She'll be a line item on a manifest. Transfer. The word hit Sophie like a physical blow. It was the industry euphemism for the point of no return, when victims were moved out of the city's reach and into the international black market. Once a person was transferred, they ceased to exist in the eyes of the law. Kang released the man's wrist, his face a mask of terrifying calm. He knew exactly what this was now. The debt was a paper shield, a way to justify the kidnapping to any crooked cops who might go poking around. They were using a harmless woman to blackmail a witness, and they were disposing of the evidence before dawn. The docks, Kang said, turning toward the exit. The $1 bill in his pocket felt like it was burning. Tell your masters that the contract just changed. I'm not just finding her. I'm coming for the ledger. The drive toward the harbor was silent, the city lights blurring into long, jagged streaks of neon against the rain-slicked glass. Kang drove with a clinical precision, but his grip on the steering wheel was tight enough to make the leather groan. Beside him, Sophie was a statue of grief, her eyes fixed on the dark horizon where the industrial cranes loomed like skeletal giants. He pulled the car into the shadow of an abandoned warehouse 2 blocks from the main pier. He didn't turn off the engine immediately, the low thrum of the motor was the only thing anchoring them to the world of the living. Get out, Kang said, his voice devoid of emotion. Sophie blinked, turning to him with a look of sudden betrayal. What? No. You said we were going to get her. I'm not leaving her. You aren't leaving her. You're staying alive, Kang countered. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a heavy, encrypted burner phone and a small, silver whistle. He pressed them into her hands. There is a safe house 3 doors down from here. It's registered to a shell company they can't trace. You go inside, you lock the door, and you do not open it unless you hear 3 rhythmic taps followed by a pause. If the sun comes up and I haven't come for you, you press the red button on that phone. A man named Min will pick you up and take you across the border. You're going alone, she realized, her voice trembling. Kang, you can't. There are dozens of them. Kang finally looked at her, and for the first time, the coldness in his eyes softened into something ancient and weary. He was breaking his own cardinal rule, never get personally invested. A fixer stayed detached, a fixer worked for the fee and walked away when the risk outweighed the reward. But the $1 bill in his pocket had become a heavy anchor. This wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the fact that in a city of millions, he was the only thing standing between an innocent woman and the abyss. I've spent my life following rules to keep the monsters at bay, he said quietly, checking the slide on his pistol with a metallic clack. But tonight, I think I'd rather be the monster they're afraid of. He stepped out of the car, the salt air whipping at his coat. He didn't look back as he signaled for her to move toward the safe house. He was no longer just a contractor fulfilling a debt. He was a man who had decided that some things, some people, were worth the price of his own survival. As he vanished into the fog of the docks, he wasn't just walking into a fight. He was walking into a reckoning. Kang moved through the fog toward a small, nondescript internet cafe tucked between 2 rusted shipping merchants. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and cheap ramen. At the very back, bathed in the flickering blue light of 6 different monitors, sat Tae-kyung. He was a twitchy, brilliant scavenger of the digital age, a man who saw the city not as bricks and mortar, but as a shifting web of data packets and signal pings. The clock is bleeding, Tae-kyung, Kang said, looming over the younger man's shoulder. Tae-kyung didn't look up, his fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard with a frantic, rhythmic clicking. I'm already in the street net, Kang. The precinct's CCTV hub is a sieve if you know which port to kick. On the center screen, graining black and white footage of the laundromat district flickered into life. Tae-kyung slowed the playback, his eyes tracking a dark shape moving through the midnight rain. There's your sedan. No plates, they're using ghost tags that scramble under infrared. But look at the driver's side mirror. He zoomed in until the pixels blurred. The housing is taped with silver duct tape. Unique identifier. Now, let's see where the city's eyes followed him. He executed a script that linked the feed to the neighboring intersections. The sedan appeared and vanished like a phantom, weaving through the industrial backroads to avoid the main toll cameras. I've got a burner trail, Tae-kyung muttered, his voice tightening with focus. The driver made a 3-second call 2 miles from the pier. I'm triangulating the pings now. A map of the harbor bloomed across the rightmost monitor, a red dot pulsing near Pier 14. He wasn't calling a boss. He was calling a crane operator. They aren't just loading a crate, Kang. They're sinking a departure. Kang watched the screen, his jaw tight. The red dot moved with agonizing slowness toward the water's edge. Every second Taekyung spent decrypting the route was a second Eunhwa spent closer to the hold of a ship. I have the manifests, Taekyung said, his face pale in the monitor's glow. A Panamanian freighter called the Acheron. It's scheduled to clear the breakwater in 20 minutes. If she's on that boat, she's gone. You'll never find her once they hit international waters. Kang straightened, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the cluttered desk. He didn't need any more data. He had the location, the vehicle, and a deadline that was measured in heartbeats. Keep the line open, Kang commanded, already turning toward the door. If that ship starts its engines, you tell me. Kang, Taekyung called out, his voice small. The driver, it's the Crow. He doesn't leave witnesses. If you go in there, you have to be faster than he is. Kang didn't answer. He was already gone, a ghost returning to the fog, his mind locked on the 20-minute countdown that stood between a contract fulfilled and a life extinguished. Kang didn't go straight to the pier. To survive the vultures, he needed more than a location, he needed the map of their minds. He found Baek Sung-ho in the back of a windowless bedding parlor that smelled of liniment and wet wool. Baek was a relic of the old guard, a man whose body was a patchwork of scars from wars fought before the city had traded its soul for glass skyscrapers. The Koslovs don't just move cargo, Kang. They move ghosts, Baek rasped, his voice sounding like gravel being turned in a drum. He didn't look up from the small wooden carving he was whittling. They've revived the old stash sites along the North Basin. The ones the Japanese built during the occupation. Deep concrete bunkers that the harbor police forgot 50 years ago. Baek spat on the floor, finally looking up with eyes clouded by cataracts but sharp with memory. When they have a high-value shipment like this woman, they don't keep her on the main dock. They use a relay system. They'll hold her in the bunker at Warehouse 12 until the Acheron clears the first buoy. Then, a fast-response skiff takes her out to meet the freighter in the deep channel. No paper trail. No customs. No hope. Kang leaned over the table, his presence a dark weight. I need the route from the bunker to the skiff. And I need to know how many crows are nesting there. At least 6, Baek said, his knife pausing. Led by the one you call the Crow. He's meticulous. He uses the siren pattern, 1 scout 5 minutes ahead, 2 in the transport, and a tail car that doesn't mind causing a pileup to block a pursuit. If you hit the transport, the tail car will turn the street into a slaughterhouse. The old man reached under the table and pulled out a hand-drawn map, the ink faded but the lines precise. It detailed the subterranean tunnels connecting the old warehouses to the hidden slips under the piers. They're moving her in 10 minutes, Kang. If you're not at the mouth of the tunnel before that skiff hits the water, you're just chasing a memory. Baek leaned back, his expression grim. In my day, we fought for pride. These Koslov boys, they fight for a ledger. They don't have hearts to stop, only bottom lines to protect. Remember that when you're in the dark. Kang took the map, the paper rough against his palm. The patterns were clear now, the fake debt, the staged kidnapping, the hidden relay. It was a well-oiled machine of human misery. He nodded once to the old soldier and stepped back into the rain. The shipment was moving, and the city's concrete veins were about to run cold. The burner phone in Kang's pocket vibrated with a sharp, insistent buzz that felt like a jagged blade against his thigh. He was halfway to Warehouse 12, his boots splashing through the oily puddles of the industrial district, when he pulled the device out. The screen flickered to life, casting a cold, sickly white glow over his features. It was a video file. No text, no demands, just a raw data burst from an untraceable origin. Kang stopped in the shadow of a rusted crane, his thumb hovering over the play button. When the footage started, his breath hitched in the freezing air. The camera was handheld, shaking slightly as it swept over a cramped, concrete room, one of Beck's hidden bunkers. In the center of the frame, tied to a wooden chair beneath a single, flickering bulb, was Eun-wha. She looked small, her gray hair disheveled and her face smeared with the dust of the laundromat floor. Her glasses were gone, leaving her squinting blindly at the lens. There was a bruise blooming across her cheekbone like a dark flower, but her jaw was set in a line of quiet, stubborn defiance. She wasn't screaming. She was breathing in shallow, measured gasps, her eyes tracking the movement of someone off camera. Then, a hand entered the frame. It was a hand Kang recognized, the knuckles scarred, a black feather of the clipped crow tattoo visible at the wrist. The fingers gripped Eun-wha's chin, forcing her to look directly into the camera. "Tell them the time, mother," a voice rasped from the shadows. It was Volkov, his tone dripping with a bored, casual cruelty. It is 3 a.m, Eun-wha whispered, her voice cracking but holding steady. 3 a.m, Volkov echoed, pulling a heavy, silver watch into the light. The second hand swept forward with an audible, rhythmic tick. The Acheron drops anchor at the mouth of the channel at 5. If the skiff isn't there to meet it, the cargo is considered spoiled. And we don't like to waste space on spoiled cargo. The video cut to black. Kang stared at the dead screen, the reflection of his own eyes staring back at him. It was a proof of life, but it was also a death warrant. 2 hours. The city was wide, the tunnels were a labyrinth, and the Koslovs had turned a living woman into a countdown. He didn't call Taekyung. He didn't look at the map. He simply closed the phone and felt the last vestiges of his restraint dissolve. The contract wasn't just about $1 anymore, it was about the 2 hours left before Eun-wha became a ghost in the deep water. He began to run, his shadow lengthening against the concrete as he headed for the mouth of the tunnel, a man racing against the rising tide of the sun. The entrance to Warehouse 12 was a rusted maw, hidden behind a mountain of rotting pallets and discarded engine blocks. Kang slipped through a gap in the corrugated steel, his movements silent as the dust motes dancing in his flashlight's periphery. The air inside didn't just smell of damp concrete, it tasted of copper and unwashed bodies, the stale, suffocating scent of a cage. He followed the hum of a distant generator, moving deeper into the bowels of the structure where the colonial-era brickwork met the modern reinforced concrete of the Koslov bunkers. He reached a heavy iron door, its hinges freshly greased. With a flick of his blade, he bypassed the simple latch and stepped into the light. He expected a holding room for Eun-wha. He didn't expect a gallery of the forgotten. The bunker was partitioned with heavy plastic sheeting, creating a series of makeshift cells. In the flickering glow of overhead work lights, Kang saw them, not just one woman, but a dozen figures huddled on thin mats. There was a young man with the hollow eyes of a runaway, a girl who couldn't have been older than 16 clutching a tattered shawl, and an elderly laborer still wearing his orange high-visibility vest. They weren't just cargo. They were a cross-section of the city's invisible class, harvested from the fringes and held in this purgatory of ghosts. Eun-wha? Kang's voice was a low, urgent rasp. A figure stirred in the far corner. Eun-wha looked up, her eyes wide and wet behind the veil of her disheveled hair. She tried to speak, but her hands were bound tightly to a support pillar. As Kang rushed toward her, the other captives began to stir, their faces pressed against the plastic dividers like spirits trying to break through a shroud. The girl in the next cell reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing Kang's coat. "Please," she whimpered, her voice a ghost of a sound. "Don't leave us here." Kang froze, his hand already on the knife to cut Eun-wha's zip ties. He looked at the dollar bill's employer, the woman he had come to save, and then at the row of terrified eyes watching him. The contract was for one life. The logic of his profession dictated that he take his target and run before the vultures returned for the transfer. Any delay was a death sentence. But as he looked at the bruised face of the woman who reminded him of a life he had never been allowed to have, and then at the others who had no one to pay $1 for their return, the iron rule in his chest expanded. "I'm not leaving anyone," Kang murmured, more to himself than to them. He turned to Eun-wha, his eyes hardening with a new, terrible resolve. "I need you to be brave. I'm going to open these doors, and you're going to lead them to the service tunnel. Can you do that?" Eun-wha nodded, her terror eclipsed by a sudden, maternal strength. Kang stood up, facing the dark corridor where the sound of heavy boots was already beginning to echo. The mission had changed. He wasn't just a fixer anymore, he was an arsonist about to burn down a network. The heavy thud of a flashbang detonating echoed through the concrete ribs of the warehouse, a blinding white scream that shattered the silence. Smoke, thick and acrid with the smell of magnesium, billowed through the plastic-walled cells. Kang moved through the haze not as a man, but as a force of nature. He ripped the heavy zip ties from Eun-wha's wrists, his eyes already scanning the perimeter for the first wave of vultures. "Go!" Through the tunnel, he shouted over the ringing in his ears, shoving a group of dazed captives toward the narrow service hatch Beck had mapped out. But the chaos was a double-edged sword. From the far end of the bunker, a black-clad figure emerged through the smoke, the man with the clipped crow on his neck. Volkov didn't fire into the crowd, he moved with the surgical coldness of a man protecting an investment. Before Kang could close the distance, Volkov lunged, snagging Eun-wha by the collar of her coat. He pressed a snub-nosed revolver to her temple and began dragging her backward toward a heavy steel elevator. "One step, Kang, and she's just a stain on the floor." Volkov roared, his eyes wild with the desperation of a man who knew he couldn't lose this cargo. The other victims scrambled into the darkness of the tunnel, their footsteps fading, but Kang stood rooted to the spot. The air was thick with the sound of approaching sirens and the rhythmic thrum-thrum of the skiff's engine vibrating through the pier pilings outside. He was caught in the middle, the protector of the many, and the hunter of the one. "Let her go, Volkov," Kang said, his voice terrifyingly level. He dropped his primary weapon, letting it clatter to the concrete. It was a calculated gamble, a feint to draw the enforcer's focus. "The docks are surrounded. You aren't making it to the Acheron." "I don't need the docks," Volkov sneered, backing into the elevator. "I just need to get her to the roof." The steel doors hissed shut, severing the connection. Kang didn't hesitate. He turned and sprinted toward the industrial stairs, his lungs burning. He was breaking every rule of survival he had ever authored. He was heading into a bottleneck, outgunned and exposed, with the transfer deadline screaming in his mind. He burst onto the roof just as the first tendrils of dawn began to gray the horizon. The skiff was waiting in the water below, and a crane was lowering a transport cage toward the deck. Volkov stood at the edge, forcing Eun-wha toward the drop. Kang didn't shout. He didn't warn. He launched himself across the rain-slicked gravel, a shadow leaping into the void, risking the fall and the fire for the sake of a $1 promise. The morning light was a pale, sickly gray, filtering through the harbor fog as the sirens of the late-arriving police finally wailed in the distance. On the pier, the silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic lapping of the black water against the pilings. Sophie stood at the edge of the cordoned-off zone, her breath hitching every time a shadow moved. When the figure finally emerged from the mist, she didn't realize it was them at first. Kang was limping, his coat torn and his face mapped with blood and salt, but his arm was wrapped firmly around Eun-wha's shoulders. The older woman was shivering, draped in an oversized tactical jacket, but her eyes were open, searching for the one thing that mattered. "Mama!" The cry tore from Sophie's throat. She collided with them, her arms wrapping around her mother with a ferocity that seemed to be the only thing keeping them all upright. They stood there for a long time, a small circle of survival in a landscape of industrial decay. Eunhwa wept silently into Sophie's neck, her hands clutching her daughter's sweater as if she were afraid the girl might dissolve into the fog. Kang stepped back, his presence receding into the shadows of a nearby warehouse. He watched them with a hollow, distant expression, the adrenaline of the night leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. He had crossed lines he promised himself he never would, he had made himself visible. As the paramedics approached, Sophie looked up, her eyes searching for the man who had walked into the dark for her. She found him leaning against a rusted pylon, lighting a cigarette with trembling fingers. She walked toward him, leaving her mother in the care of the medics. "You saved her," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "I didn't know if you'd really come back." Kang didn't look at her. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the crumpled $1 bill. It was stained now, a small smudge of red marking the corner. He held it out to her. "Take it," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. Sophie shook her head, pushing his hand back. "No. That was the contract. You did the job." Kang's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close to it. He pressed the bill into her palm and closed her fingers over it. The coldness that had defined him for years seemed to have shifted, replaced by a weary, human weight. "The contract is void," he said, turning to walk away into the blurring light of the new day. "You overpaid, Sophie. No one should have to buy a miracle for $1. As he vanished into the city's waking roar, Sophie looked down at the money. It was just paper, but it felt heavier than gold, a receipt for a soul that had decided, for one night, to come home. The city began to wake, oblivious to the war that had been waged beneath its skin. The streetlights flickered out, surrendered to a pale, watery sun that couldn't quite burn through the harbor haze. Kang sat in the back of a 24-hour diner 3 miles from the docks, the smell of burnt coffee and grease grounding him in a way the adrenaline never could. He reached into his pocket. He hadn't actually given the $1 back. In the final moment on the pier, he had palmed a different bill, a decoy to give Sophie the closure she needed. The original $1, the one Sophie had smoothed with her trembling, desperate fingers, stayed with him. It was crinkled and stained with a drop of his own blood, a flimsy slip of paper that had somehow outweighed his years of cynical detachment. He pulled out a burner phone and dialed a number that didn't exist in any directory. "Min," Kang said when the line clicked open. "The safe house near Pier 14. Don't close it. I want it turned into a transit point, not for cargo, but for protection. I'm setting up a fund. Anyone who comes to that door with a story like Eunhwa's gets a lawyer, a ticket out, or a guard. No questions. No fees." "That's a lot of overhead for no return," Kang, the voice on the other end, remarked, sounding surprised. "What's the contract?" Kang looked down at the $1 bill resting on the laminate tabletop. "The contract is already paid in full." He hung up and slid the bill into a small, plastic sleeve he usually used for evidence. He didn't put it in his wallet with the rest of his currency. He tucked it into the lining of his coat, right over his heart. For years, Kang Joon-seo had been a man defined by what he was willing to do for a price. He was a fixer, a shadow, a ghost that did the dirty work of the living. But as he watched the morning commuters begin to clog the sidewalks, mothers walking children to school, shopkeepers rolling up their metal shutters, he realized the weight in his pocket wasn't a burden. It was an anchor. He wasn't the man he was yesterday. He was still a hunter, and he still lived in the dark, but the darkness had a boundary now. He kept the $1 as a reminder that even in a city of millions where everything was for sale, there was one thing that couldn't be bought, and one man who had finally chosen which side of the line he belonged on. Kang stood up, left a 20 on the table for a $3 coffee, and walked out into the light.